Warning: this video contains disturbing content, including mutilation and gore. Viewer discretion is advised, especially for those sensitive to such material. The old and resentful woman was not just a figure forgotten by society. She was a specter of dark memories, pain, and vengeance accumulated over decades. Born in a small, isolated village, her name had long been erased by the dust of time. As a young girl, she was considered beautiful, with hair black as night and eyes that sparkled like stars. But her life, marked by tragedies, shaped her into something far different from what destiny seemed to promise. The first tragedy occurred when she was only 8 years old. A devastating fire consumed the small wooden house where she lived with her parents and younger brother. She was the sole survivor, waking up in the hospital with minor burns but deep emotional scars. Her body remained intact, but her soul would never be the same. The neighbors whispered, insinuating that she had caused the fire. Cursed, some said. Possessed, others claimed. She was taken in by a distant uncle, a cold and indifferent man who treated her more as a burden than family. The years that followed were a sequence of abuse, neglect, and loneliness. In her teenage years, she began to notice her appearance changing. Her hair started falling out in clumps, and her skin became pale and dry, like old parchment. She was diagnosed with a rare degenerative disease, something the medicine of the time could neither explain nor treat. Over time, she became a recluse, hiding from a world that despised her. It was during this period that she began to develop a fascination with morbid things. Dead animals, anatomy books, horror stories. Everything dark seemed to draw her in. She spent hours staring at her own reflection in the mirror, trying to imagine how she might regain her lost beauty. But as her obsession grew, her mental state deteriorated further. The villagers began avoiding her completely, fueling rumors of her alleged connection to witchcraft. One day, in middle age, she vanished. Her house, filled with bizarre objects and unfinished experiments, was abandoned and eventually demolished. Rumors claimed she was last seen in the forest, carrying a large, heavy suitcase. Others said she had died and that her spirit wandered among the trees. But the truth was far more sinister. She had moved to an isolated cabin on the outskirts of a small, forgotten town. There, she lived for decades, venturing out only at night to gather supplies and observe people from a distance. Her presence was noted only as a whisper, a shadow passing unnoticed. Time marched on, and she continued to age, growing ever more deformed and bitter. Her only companion was the memory of what she had lost: beauty, youth, acceptance. Every night, she dreamed of ways to reclaim what was rightfully hers. She tried home remedies, salves, even dark magic, but nothing worked. Her frustration turned into hatred, not just for herself but for everyone around her. That was when she began to plan. If she couldn't reclaim her beauty naturally, she would take it another way. She started with animals, testing methods to preserve and use their skin to cover her own deformities. But it wasn't enough. Her mind was fixed on something greater, something more effective. That's when she began observing the inhabitants of the nearby town, especially the children. They were pure, untouched by time, exactly what she needed. When the opportunity finally arose, she didn't hesitate. A young family trusted her to care for their baby while they went to handle some errands. The baby was just the first. Over the years, others vanished, but the connection was never made. Who would suspect a frail and forgotten old woman? And now there she was in her dirty, dimly lit bathroom, about to complete yet another stage of her macabre ritual. The resentful old woman stood before the bathtub, her sunken eyes fixed on the murky water. The steam had long since disappeared, leaving the room cold and cloaked in an oppressive silence. She stood motionless for about 15 minutes, as if measuring every second. The only thing breaking her stillness was the faint tremor of her thin, arthritic fingers gripping the rusted edge of the tub. Finally, she was certain. He was dead. The resentful old woman stood before the bathtub. With a calculated motion, she lifted her rotting foot off his head. Her peeling, sickly-colored skin contrasted with the water, which now displayed a cloudy, reddish hue. Slowly, the body floated to the surface, emerging with a macabre softness. as if gravity had ceased to act upon it. His face, waxy white, stared blankly at the ceiling, while strands of hair fanned out in the water like algae in a stagnant pond. The old woman leaned forward, the acrid smell of the room not seeming to bother her. She grabbed his head with her yellowed, curved nails, which pierced his soft skin with ease. The sound that followed was a mix of crackling and scraping, a noise that would have sent chills down anyone's spine. But she didn't flinch. With a single motion, she hoisted the lifeless body and hurled it onto the floor with a force that was shocking for someone with her frail appearance. The impact was brutal. The back of his head gave way as if made of fresh clay, flattening grotesquely. The sides split open, and brain fluids mixed with blood oozed through the cracks in his skull. The thick liquid formed small puddles that glistened under the dim, yellowish light of the bathroom. She stood there, watching for a moment as if evaluating her own handiwork, before kneeling beside the body. From the corner of the bathroom, she retrieved an old, rusted pair of scissors that looked like they'd been there for years. The blades were chipped, and each movement emitted a screech that mingled with the distant sound of dripping water. She began cutting the skin around his head, careful not to damage the eyelids. Each incision was made with meticulous precision, though not without difficulty. Her trembling fingers hindered the task, and the absence of a few, lost in some long-forgotten incident, made the process all the more agonizing. But she didn't flinch. The metallic, acrid smell of blood mixed with the sour stench of her own decaying flesh. But none of it seemed to affect her. Her eyes were fixed on the task, her brows furrowed in concentration. When she finally finished circling the entire head, she dropped the scissors and gripped the skull with both hands. With a single pull that demanded all the strength her frail arms could muster, she tore the head from the body. A grotesque sound of flesh ripping and bones cracking echoed through the bathroom. Without even glancing at the head now in her hands, she stood and discarded it casually, tossing it into the sink. The head landed with a dull thud, its lifeless eyes staring at the ceiling once again, now accompanied by a macabre smile that seemed to form involuntarily from the position of the jaw. The old woman pushed aside the dirty gray hair that fell across her face. It reached down to her knees, tangled and greasy, as if untouched by a comb for decades. Her eyes were cavernous, sunken deep into a face marked by time and decay. Her cheeks sagged and her toothless mouth twisted into expressions of focus and pain. She was the embodiment of ugliness, a being that seemed to have crawled out of some forgotten nightmare. But that was about to change. From the corner of the bathroom, she pulled out a long, thin needle, rusted in several places, and a thick, grimy thread that looked ready to disintegrate. Sitting before the stained mirror, she began her work. She took the bloodied, cold skin she had removed from the head and positioned it over her own face. With the needle trembling in her hands, she began to sew. Each stitch was a test of endurance. The thread passed through the foreign skin and pierced her own, sliding through flesh and nerves with terrifying ease. She didn't care about the pain. She didn't even blink as the blood, both hers and his, dripped in streams down the sides of her face, soaking her tattered clothes in the filthy bathroom floor. 15 minutes passed. 15 minutes of silent, determined agony. When she finally finished, the bathroom was in disarray. Puddles of blood and scraps of flesh covered the floor, and the old woman was on the verge of collapse. Her knees buckled, her hands still trembled, and her vision blurred from the intense pain coursing through every fiber of her being. But none of that mattered. She stood up, unsteady, and looked at herself in the mirror. For the first time in years, a smile, crooked, malevolent, and toothless, spread across her face. The boy's skin was stitched around her eyes and mouth, hanging grotesquely and ill-fitted. The thick stitches formed a crude, uneven frame around her face. But to her, it was beauty. She was no longer a witch or a decaying creature. No, now, she was beautiful. As her smile widened, her thoughts turned to the family across the street. They had trusted her to care for their baby, and at that moment, that trust felt like a divine giftee. She laughed, a raspy, grating sound that echoed through the bathroom like breaking glass. Nothing else mattered anymore, because She finally had a child's face. Thank you for watching. Subscribe for more.